Hitler didn't hate the Jews just because of race or religion. He believed they were the single greatest threat to humanity's survival. She realized this after reading, for the 100th time, his forgotten speeches, uncovering a worldview that was as twisted as it was internally consistent. To Hitler, true socialism could only rise if the Jewish nemesis was destroyed. One race was meant to ascend, the other had to be erased. But why did he believe that? And what does it reveal about the mind behind the Third Reich? He wasn't just trying to win a war, he was trying to defeat history itself. Hitler didn't see the Jews as a political threat. He saw them as the final barrier between the world as it was, impure, chaotic, morally weak, and the world as it should be, racially pure, spiritually redeemed, and evolutionarily advanced. To him, this wasn't a conflict of nations. It was a war of principles. On one side, altruism, honor, sacrifice. On the other, cunning, calculation, what he called Jewish egoism. And in his mind, these forces could never coexist. What Hitler believed he was fighting was metaphysical, not just territory, not just power, but a historical sickness. He thought the human race could only evolve if it was cleansed of Jewish influence. Extreme? Yes, but disturbingly coherent within the logic of his own ideology. She didn't see this in his most famous speeches, but in the pauses, in his words about labor, value, sacrifice, and purity. There, his obsession surfaced, the fear that the Aryan race might not survive unless its nemesis was erased. And here's the point most people miss, and it changes everything. For Hitler, there could be no salvation without destruction. If that opening caught you off guard, wait until you see how he planned to turn this theory into actual policy, and what that reveals about the hidden structure of Nazi ideology. We'll get there. But first, if this kind of deep analysis resonates with you, if you feel something's missing in how history is usually told, then subscribe to the channel now. We're close to hitting a major milestone, and your support is key to helping us keep producing this level of storytelling with the accuracy and intensity you deserve. And more than that, being here means you always walk away with another piece of the global puzzle. She couldn't look away from the silent logic running through his speeches. Hitler's hatred wasn't random. He didn't see Jews as a moral flaw. He saw them as the evolutionary opposite, not evil, just incompatible. At the core of his worldview was a terrifying belief that races were not cultural identities, but distinct forms of existence. Each had followed its own evolutionary path. The Aryan race, he believed, had been shaped by the brutal cold of the North, scarcity, hardship, and the need for mutual sacrifice. From that came altruism, honor, loyalty to the collective. The Jewish race, in his eyes, had evolved in urban environments, thriving through adaptability, strategy, and extreme individualism. He didn't frame this as ideology, he framed it as biology, a corrupted form of Darwinism, but one with chilling consistency. To Hitler, this wasn't a war of ideas, it was a biological conflict. Behind closed doors, Nazi officials repeated it like a sacred mantra. You couldn't just fight Jews. You had to protect the genetic core of humanity. Real socialism, according to Hitler, could only be built by a race genetically predisposed to selflessness. If not, it would always be corrupted from within. And here lies the contradiction he tried to solve with violence. If morality was genetic, and socialism needed moral purity, then the Jewish threat had to be removed. Not as an act of hatred, but as an act of biological cleansing. But there's a detail in this logic that few people talk about. And it completely changes how Hitler saw his own role in history. I'll show you that next. He believed humanity's future wasn't shaped by weapons or diplomacy, but by what lived inside the heart of each race. To Hitler, the Aryan lived for something beyond himself. He was the race of builders, of memory, of sacrifice. He died for honor. He worked for the collective. He dreamed of giving. The Jew, in contrast, was seen as a shapeshifter, surviving through mimicry. He changed form, language, borders. He adapted like no other people, and in Hitler's mind, that was the danger. Not military power, but the ability to infiltrate the moral systems of other civilizations and quietly erode them. This idea, repeated in pamphlets, books, speeches, and racial science lectures, was the foundation of what Hitler called the existential struggle. While the Aryan shed blood for the nation, the Jew, he claimed, thrived in finance, the press, the arts, without getting his hands dirty. The contrast was absolute. One created, the other fed off the creation. In his worldview, the Aryan spirit was the blueprint of civilization. The Jew was the agent of decay. And that, Hitler argued, is why socialism could only exist within a racially pure population. The parasite wasn't just an outsider, it was a moral disabler. And that belief leads to a far darker conclusion than most realize. One that explains how Nazi theory would soon become extermination policy. We'll get there. She wondered how someone could build an economy based on hatred. But Hitler didn't see hatred. He saw historical justice. To him, labor wasn't just an economic necessity. It was a moral symbol. The man who worked with his hands, the farmer, the soldier, the builder, was the true hero of the nation. He didn't just produce goods. He anchored value to effort, to sweat, to sacrifice. Work was sacred. And the Jew? In Hitler's mind, he was the opposite. A middleman. A manipulator of values he didn't create. He didn't till the soil, he traded it. He didn't forge steel, he speculated on its price. Hitler believed the Jew had invented a lie, that value could exist without labor. That money could breed more money. This is where Nazi ideology and economic theory fused into a weapon. The banking system, the stock market, advertising, these were seen not as tools, but as symptoms of a deeper disease. And to Hitler, that disease had a name. Socialism, in this twisted view, wasn't just about sharing wealth. It was about purifying the origin of wealth, stripping value down to physical effort, erasing what he called abstract parasites. She remembered a line from one of his speeches. "He who does not work with his body betrays his race." It wasn't metaphor. It was doctrine, carved into policy. But there was something hidden in that logic, something that made it even darker. What if his hatred of the Jew wasn't just about what he did, but about what he prevented from becoming real? She realized that, to Hitler, the Jew wasn't just a physical enemy. He was a phantom, something that moved through the cracks of civilization, unseen, untouched, yet always present. That's how he viewed it. A force that didn't need armies or flags to conquer the world. In his deeper writings, he spoke of the Jewish state as if it were an invisible empire, diffuse, global, omnipresent. He wasn't referring to Israel. That didn't exist yet. This wasn't about a nation. It was about a structure. A shadow power he believed controlled the press, the banks, the political parties, commerce, cinema, academia. A state with no land, but with roots in every land. This idea was the cornerstone, the fantasy that made everything else possible. Because if the enemy isn't just outside, but everywhere, then any action, no matter how brutal, becomes self-defense. That was the logic. Genocide wasn't aggression, it was cleansing. That's when paranoia became policy. She understood. In Hitler's mind, each individual Jew was a cell in a larger body, a silent organism working to sabotage the Aryan spirit. And if that was true, then no Jew could ever be innocent. Each one carried the seed of decay. What he built wasn't just a political project. It was a racial apocalypse, an end of history where salvation required total sacrifice, the disappearance of the other. Otherwise, he claimed, the world would fall, and with it, everything noble, pure, and Aryan. But there's a devastating consequence buried in this thinking, a detail most people prefer to ignore, because it reveals that genocide wasn't a deviation. It was a planned necessity. We're almost there. She finally understood. Hitler wasn't trying to rule the present. He wanted to rewrite the future, erase what he called historical anomalies, and reset civilization. And his language revealed everything. He didn't speak politically, he spoke in absolutes: end, judgment, redemption. To him, Germany wasn't just a country, it was the altar. And the Aryan people? Humanity's last chance to survive the moral collapse. A collapse, he claimed, was already underway. Silent, invisible, embedded in art, in ideas, in the very air of modern cities. That's why this wasn't just a war. It was a race against time itself. He saw himself as a restorer of cosmic order. Someone born not to lead, but to cleanse, to do what no other civilization had dared to do, cut out the rot at its root. It was a messianic mission, and like all redemption, it demanded sacrifice. She remembers one chilling line: if we win, the world will be pure. If we lose, it will be damned. That wasn't just rhetoric. It was the engine behind the final solution. In his mind, every Jew killed wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a step toward salvation, a defense against species-wide extinction. And that explains why extermination wasn't whispered or hidden. It was destined, embedded in his vision of utopia. But there's one final gear in this machinery of belief, one that makes the entire structure even more chilling. It's what convinced Hitler that even mass suffering couldn't stop what he believed was coming. That's next. She saw the cracks forming long before the collapse. Beneath the rigid slogans and military parades, something was quietly breaking. Hitler had promised a racial socialism, a system where every citizen would matter. But only if they were pure. Collective strength, yes, but no dissent. Brotherhood, but only among the genetically acceptable. A perfect order, built on a foundation of bones. At first, they believed. Farmers, workers, soldiers, crushed by war, humiliation, and economic chaos. They heard socialism and thought of justice, stability, bread. But they didn't realize, in Hitler's warped dictionary, socialism meant total submission to blood and to the leader. He didn't betray socialism. He turned it into a weapon. The collective only had value if it was racially uniform. The weak, the ill, the mixed, they were cracks in the wall. The failure wasn't in execution, it was in the premise. Human life is diverse, messy, unpredictable. And when your system demands absolute purity, every exception becomes a threat. That's how the regime began to devour itself. Party leaders who questioned racial orthodoxy were sidelined. Old allies became traitors. Entire communities were sacrificed in the name of ideological coherence. The project didn't collapse from outside pressure. It imploded under its own logic. Purity requires a constant enemy. There's always one more group to purge. she saw the fatal flaw. Hitler's utopia didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because its success required the erasure of what made life human. And no empire can survive long in that vacuum. But one piece was still missing. Something personal, something visceral. Because Hitler didn't just design the machine. He believed he was the soul of it. And that changes everything. She saw it clearly now. At the center of the empire stood not a genius, but a man trying to become a myth. Hitler didn't want power. He wanted immortality. To be remembered not just as a leader, but as the one who cleansed humanity of its weakness. But there was a fatal flaw in that vision. He designed a perfect world for imperfect beings. Hitler saw himself as chosen, not by God, but by history itself. A vessel of nature, a force sent to restore balance. His speeches were filled with near-religious language, destiny, redemption, purification. He didn't just speak to the people, he spoke for time itself, as if he were the last bridge before rebirth. And that's where he fell. Because by placing himself above humanity, he lost sight of what makes it human. Complexity, contradiction, imperfection. In seeking total purity, he didn't just destroy millions, he destroyed the very idea of a future. His system was too rigid to adapt, too absolute to forgive. And that's not strength, it's weakness, wearing a mask of power. She saw it in the bunker reports. He was still talking about victory, even as Berlin collapsed around him. Still dreaming of phantom armies and impossible reversals. But that wasn't faith. It was denial. A leader who built a world that couldn't allow mistakes, and who, when it failed, couldn't survive his own myth. In the end, he wasn't a messiah. He was a fanatic, drunk on his own reflection, demanding others die for a delusion. And maybe that was his most human flaw, mistaking obsession for truth, and dragging millions into the fire with him. But the worst hadn't yet happened, because one day, all of this ideology would become action. And when it did, the entire world would bleed. She knew this was the core of the horror, but she also knew it was where the truth lived. Raw, exposed, without ideological filters. The final solution wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an overreaction or the madness of war. It was the logical end of a belief that evil lived in the blood of the other, and salvation meant erasing it. Hitler didn't murder millions because he lost control. He did it because, in his mind, everything he believed required it. If Jews were the embodiment of decay, if socialism needed racial purity, if the Aryan was humanity's last hope, then extermination wasn't a crime. It was a moral duty. The final solution was a system. Tables, logistics, transport schedules. Trains filled with men, women, and children who, to the regime, weren't people. They were a genetic flaw to be removed. And the weaker the Reich became, the more efficiently the killing machine worked. Because in the end, destruction became the only meaning left. She saw the real reason, the core that kept Nazism alive. It wasn't a love for strength or order. It was fear, a deep, unspoken terror of the different. Hitler needed to believe that the problem was out there, because to admit the failure was inside the ideology itself would have broken him. The final solution was a mirror. The moment the regime looked inward and chose to kill everything that contradicted the myth. That's why it wasn't enough to win the war. They had to erase every trace of the other. But truth, she knew, has no grave deep enough. And that leads to one final question. What if Hitler's greatest enemy was never real at all, but simply the reflection of what he feared most in himself? She paused. Not because the story had ended, but because everything that needed to be seen was now in plain sight. And that's what made it even more disturbing. Hitler's enemy may never have truly existed. The Jew, the demonic, manipulative, parasitic figure, may have been nothing more than a projection, a mirror built to reflect what he couldn't face within himself. Because if he admitted the flaw was internal, the entire system would collapse. It was easier to blame a people than confront his own impotence. More comfortable to erase millions than admit that his utopia was, from the beginning, an impossible fiction. The fear of the other was fear of the self. She wondered, why did so many follow him? Why did they cheer, obey, kill? Because they, too, wanted to escape guilt. They traded responsibility for delusion. Every brutal act wasn't just hatred. It was a desperate attempt to keep the lie alive. But history has a cruel symmetry. Hitler wanted to be remembered as Europe's redeemer. He ended as its warning. His empire crumbled. His ideal of purity was shattered by reality. His dream was buried beneath ashes, bodies, and shame. In the end, she understood what few dare say aloud. Hitler didn't just hate the Jew for what he was, but for what he represented. The living proof that no civilization is pure, that every totalitarian dream is born from a void that doesn't want to be filled, but hidden. And that's why this story must be told. Because the next empire that rises, promising absolute redemption, may also begin by hunting mirrors. And if you've made it this far, it's because you understand that this isn't just history. It's a wake-up call. You need to subscribe to the channel, not to receive notifications, but to understand the world more clearly than 99% of people. The past isn't past. It still breathes. And now, click on this video here on the screen. It will show you what most people never realized about that period. Because only those who understand how it all began can see what's coming back.